The cruelest part was not simply that an empire once tried to force the people of God to bow before idols. The cruelest part was this: even after the temple was cleansed, even after the altar was rebuilt, even after the lamps were lit again and songs rose through Jerusalem, blood still had to fall on the stones. That is what makes the story of First Maccabees heavier than many people expect. If you only remember the joy of rededication, you remember the light. But you do not yet remember the price of keeping that light alive. Hanukkah was not the end of the struggle. It was proof that the struggle had become worth everything. The temple was pure again. Yes, the sanctuary no longer echoed with pagan defilement. The altar had been rebuilt. The sacred rhythms had begun again. For the first time in a long time, Israel could breathe. But breathing is not the same as being safe. Worship had been restored. But freedom had not. The empire still stood. The armies of the Seleucids still moved. The politics of powerful men still pressed down on Judea. The lamp was burning again, but the sword had not been laid down. And that is the hard truth many victories carry. Sometimes the moment people celebrate as the ending is really only the moment they realize what must still be defended. Judas Maccabeus had already become a name that sounded like courage itself. He had risen out of grief and outrage, out of a father's holy resistance, out of a nation that was being bent toward forgetting who it was. He had led men who were outnumbered, under-equipped, and exhausted. And yet he had broken armies that should have crushed him. He had driven back forces sent by a kingdom that believed Jewish faith could be erased. He had watched the sanctuary restored. He had seen joy return to a place soaked in desecration. But what comes after such a moment is often harder than people imagine. Winning back holy ground is one thing, guarding it while empires regroup is another. The rededication of the temple did not dissolve the Seleucid state. It did not end hostile pressure from surrounding enemies. It did not magically repair every village that had been ravaged, every family that had been torn apart, every fear that had settled into the bones of a hunted people. Judea had seen a miracle of restoration, but it still lived inside the reach of imperial violence. That is why the story turns so quickly from celebration back to conflict, because the men who had purified the temple now had to protect the people who worshipped in it. Judas did not fight only for symbols. He did not risk everything merely so that a ceremony could be remembered. He fought because covenant life required space to live. He fought because worship is not an abstract idea when a regime is trying to define your children, your laws, your food, your calendar, your body, and your future. He fought because if a people cannot live according to the commands they believe God has given them, then the attack is not just political. It is spiritual, it is civilizational, it is an attempt to rewrite memory itself. So the campaigns continued. First, Maccabees shows us a leader who could not rest inside one beautiful victory. Again and again, Judas moved to defend Jewish communities under threat. In the south, in Idumea, in the east beyond the Jordan, in Gilead, in the north, in Galilee, danger pressed in. There were Jews scattered in vulnerable places, exposed among hostile neighbors, waiting to see whether anyone would come for them. Judas did. He gathered men. He struck enemies who were encircling Jewish settlements. He broke sieges. He escorted families to safety. He moved not only as a warrior, but as a shepherd under fire. That matters because it means his story is larger than battlefield glory. Judas was not only a man chasing heroic victories, he was carrying a people through emergency after emergency, trying to keep them from being swallowed piece by piece. Imagine the weight of that kind of leadership. Every triumph creates new expectations. Every rescue brings new pleas. Every village saved reminds you of another village still exposed. Every festival of praise is followed by reports from the frontier. A commander in such a season cannot simply become a legend and enjoy being admired. He has to wake up the next day to more widows, more supply shortages, more frightened fathers, more boys becoming soldiers before they have had time to become men. There is a version of courage people love because it looks clean. The warrior raises the sword, defeats the enemy, and peace follows. But the courage of Judas was not clean. It was repetitive. It was costly. It was lived inside uncertainty. It was not the courage of one final stand that solved everything. It was the courage to keep showing up when each victory only bought time. That is often the hardest kind of faithfulness, not the dramatic beginning, the long middle, the part where the miracle has happened, but the pressure has not disappeared. The part where people say, "Didn't we already win?" And the honest answer is we won something real, but now we have to live inside what it cost. The Seleucid world itself was unstable. Kings died, regents maneuvered, rivals fought for power, and for a people like the Jews of Judea, that instability could mean opportunity one month and catastrophe the next. Policy could shift with a death in the palace. A promise could become a threat as soon as another man took the throne. Temporary relief never meant lasting security. That is one of the haunting patterns of the book. So much hangs on decisions made far away by men who do not love the people whose lives they can rearrange with a decree. At moments, it appeared that peace might be possible. There were negotiations, there were pauses, there were gestures that suggested the right to live by ancestral law might be tolerated. But the deeper conflict had not been resolved. Judea wanted to remain Judea. Imperial power wanted Judea manageable. Those are not the same thing. And when an empire sees a people refusing to disappear, it rarely stops by admitting defeat. It changes tactics. It appoints new men. It sends new armies. It weaponizes internal divisions. It searches for collaborators. It turns religion into politics and politics into religious pressure. That is where another figure enters the story with dark significance. Alcimus, placed into the high priesthood under foreign backing, represented more than one man's ambition. He represented the wound of compromised leadership, because sometimes the danger to a people is not only the brute force outside them. Sometimes the danger is that power finds someone willing to wear sacred clothing while serving foreign interests. This is part of what makes the Maccabean story burn with such intensity. It is not only about Jews versus Greeks or the faithful versus soldiers. It is also about what happens when holy offices are entangled with coercive politics. It is about how deeply a nation can be harmed when leadership at the altar no longer stands with the covenant it is supposed to protect. Then came Nicanor. He was sent by the Seleucid king Demetrius. At first, the situation looked uncertain, even fluid. There were moments of diplomacy, moments when the future seemed unresolved. But suspicion hardened, pressure mounted, conflict returned. And when it returned like it always does in this book, with human lives on the line. Judas met Nicanor in battle and won a stunning victory. Nicanor fell. His defeat was remembered so strongly that it became a commemorated event. For a people constantly told to submit, every such victory said the same thing. We are still here. We have not agreed to vanish. The God of our fathers has not been erased from this land. But a dangerous illusion can grow after repeated triumphs. People begin to think the momentum itself will carry them. They begin to believe courage can outrun exhaustion forever. They begin to think a symbol cannot fall because it has become too necessary. History is cruel to that kind of certainty, because after Nicanor came Bacchides, and Bacchides did not come as a rumor, he came with force. This is where the story tightens around Judas like a closing fist. The man who had already done the impossible more than once now faced a fresh army, a fresh crisis, and a familiar problem. Numbers, not ideas, not inspiration, numbers. There are moments when conviction alone does not remove the fact that the enemy has more men, more resources, more room for error. First, Maccabees tells us that many of Judas's fighters looked at the size of the opposing force and lost heart. This is one of the most human moments in the entire story. Not because they were cowards, but because they were tired. There is a difference. These were men who had already seen war, men who knew exactly what a larger army meant, men who understood that zeal does not stop arrows, and courage does not make a sword lighter after years of battle. What had once been a larger force shrank. Fear spread through the ranks. Thousands became hundreds. By the time the battle near Elaza approached its final shape, Judas stood with a painfully small remnant. And now we see the true burden of a symbol, because when you become the face of resistance, your choices stop being private. If you stand, others will call it glory. If you retreat, others will call it prudence. But you are the one who has to choose, with death in front of you. Judas chose to stand. The tradition preserves his refusal to flee as a matter of honor and devotion to his people. Not because he was reckless in some childish sense, but because he believed there are moments when the only thing more painful than death is abandoning the cause that gave meaning to your life. He had not spent years teaching Israel to stand before kings, idols, and armies, only to end as a man running from the field while the heart of the movement collapsed behind him. So Elaza became his last battle. Try to see it not as a distant paragraph in ancient history, but as a final human scene. Dust rising under thousands of feet, horns cutting through the air, men adjusting armor with shaking hands, the terrible knowledge that many of them will not see the sunset. Judas reading the fear in the faces around him, and knowing he cannot afford to borrow fear from any of them. The right wing of the enemy exposed just enough to invite a strike. A choice made in seconds, a charge launched with the kind of ferocity only desperation and conviction can create. For a moment it worked. Judas and his men drove hard against one side of the enemy formation. They pushed, they broke part of the line, they pursued. It was the kind of aggressive move that had made his name feared before, the kind of blow that said the smaller force would not die politely. But battlefields are merciless to even the bravest momentum. While Judas pressed one side, the rest of the enemy turned. Forces gathered, the trap tightened, the pursued became the encircled, and then the man who had become the heartbeat of revolt fell. First Maccabees does not turn that moment into sentimental theater. It tells it with the starkness of history. Judas died in battle, and his men fled. At plainness somehow makes it heavier. No dramatic rescue, no heavenly intervention in the final instant. No immediate reversal. The leader dies, the movement reels, the field belongs to the enemy. That is the kind of ending many people do not know how to hold, because we prefer stories where the hero's faithfulness guarantees that he sees the finished harvest. We prefer narratives where the one who starts the liberation also gets to stand in the peace that follows. But Scripture and sacred history are often more honest than our preferences. Sometimes the one who lights the fire is not the one who warms himself beside it. And that hurts. It hurts because Judas was not just a military commander. He had become proof that resistance was possible. He had become a visible contradiction to despair. He was the man who made people believe that holiness was not too weak for history, that covenant loyalty could still move armies, that desecration did not have the final word. When a man like that falls, the loss is not only strategic. It is psychological, spiritual, national. A people can survive the death of a soldier. It is far harder to survive the death of a symbol. So do not move too quickly past the silence that must have followed his death. There are losses that take the breath out of a whole generation. Imagine Jerusalem after the news spread. Imagine the mothers who had prayed for him, the old men who had spoken his name with gratitude, the young fighters who had learned courage by watching him, the priests who remembered the day he purified the temple. Imagine what it felt like for the city to hold both memories at once. The restored sanctuary still standing, and the man who helped restore it now gone. That is the emotional center of the story after Hanukkah. Not only joy defended by war, but joy shadowed by grief. The temple remained, the leader did not, and here's where many stories would end. The champion dies, the cause is remembered, maybe even honored. The people whisper his name for generations. Roll the credits. Let memory do the rest. But first, Maccabees refuses to end there, because covenant history is rarely built by one person alone. The fall of Judas was devastating, but it was not the extinction of the faith he served. Jonathan, his brother, stepped forward. Now this is where the story changes. Rhythm. Jonathan is not simply Judas repeated, and that difference matters. Because if the book only offered one type of leadership, it would be less honest and less useful. Judas had burned with battlefield intensity. Jonathan had to learn endurance in a different register. He inherited not the clean momentum of a rising movement, but the shattered aftermath of a fallen hero. That kind of inheritance is brutally difficult. It is one thing to lead when people are inspired. It is another to lead when they are disoriented, grieving and uncertain, whether the best days of the cause died with the man they loved most. Jonathan did not get to begin with a symbolic victory like temple rededication. He began under pressure. He began in a world where the enemy thought the movement had been broken. He began with fewer illusions and more survival instincts. He and Simon gathered those who remained loyal and withdrew when necessary. They moved into the wilderness. They operated from difficult places. The conflict did not stop being cruel. At one point, another brother, John, was killed during this hard season, another reminder that this family was not harvesting glory without bleeding for it. The cost kept rising, but what Jonathan lacked in the blazing legend of Judas, he compensated for with resilience, patience, and political intelligence. He learned to survive in the fractures of a divided empire. And this is one of the most fascinating developments in the book. The same Seleucid instability that had made Judea vulnerable also created openings. Rival claimants to the throne needed allies. Competing kings needed legitimacy, soldiers, and support. Jonathan understood that weakness in the empire could be used. So the struggle entered a new phase. Not pure retreat, not pure assault. A dangerous mix of fighting, bargaining, waiting, and striking when the moment opened. Jonathan became the kind of leader who could read not only the battlefield, but the cracks in systems. He knew that keeping the people alive sometimes required something quieter than the glorious charge. It required timing, and there is wisdom in that. because not every faithful leader is called to win the same way. Some break the enemy line, others outlast the enemy's confusion, some are remembered for thunder, others for staying power. Both kinds of leadership can serve the same covenant. Jonathan's rise shows that the Maccabean story was never only about one heroic personality. It was about a house, a family, and beyond that, a people who refused surrender across generations. He secured positions of influence. He gained recognition. Eventually, in the shifting politics of the time, he was appointed high priest. That was not the full end of danger, far from it, but it marked something profound. The movement that enemies expected to die with Judas had not only survived, it had re-entered the center of national life. Still, the story refuses to romanticize the path. Jonathan's end, too, was marked by treachery and death. He was lured, seized, and ultimately killed. Again the pattern appears. The faithful advance, and the cost remains real. Leaders rise, and leaders fall. Victory does not come untouched by grief. Which brings us to Simon. If Judas was the blade of the movement, and Jonathan its endurance under pressure, Simon became its consolidator. He inherited a cause soaked in sacrifice, and pushed it toward something earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Under Simon, the possibility of Jewish self-rule became tangible in a new way. This did not mean all danger disappeared. It did mean the long labor of resistance began to yield visible political fruit. Simon gained concessions. He secured greater freedom from foreign domination. He strengthened cities. He helped to remove the oppressive Seleucid stronghold in Jerusalem, the citadel that had stood as a reminder that even near the holy city, foreign control still had teeth. When that fortress finally fell, it was not just a military event. It was symbolic release. A wound in the heart of Jerusalem was finally addressed. The imagery surrounding Simon's success is striking. Joy, palm branches, praise, music, celebration. The people marking the downfall of a hated stronghold. It echoes with the memory of earlier liberation scenes in Israel's story. Not because history was repeating mechanically, but because the same divine drama kept surfacing. Tyranny had built itself into sacred space, and once again it was being pushed back. Under Simon, the Jewish people entered a new era of self-governance. The language used in the tradition is full of dignity and relief. People sat under their vines and fig trees. The land knew a measure of peace. The humiliation of foreign taxation and domination eased. Leadership was recognized in Jewish hands for the first time in generations. There was a real experience of autonomy. Think about what that means in the emotional logic of the whole story. Mattathias had started with refusal. Judas had fought like a storm. Jonathan had endured in uncertainty. Simon saw the shape of a freer Judea emerge. Some sowed, some watered, some guarded what others had planted, but none of them reached that point without blood. And that may be one of the deepest truths in First Maccabees. The covenant was not preserved by one shining moment. It was preserved by a layered faithfulness, one generation refusing assimilation, one leader reclaiming the temple, another learning diplomacy, another stabilizing governance. The inheritance survived because multiple lives were poured into it. This is also where the book becomes honest about the complexity of success, because the rise of the Hasmonean house, for all its significance, was not the beginning of a perfect golden age. It was a real achievement, but like many achievements in history, it carried future tensions inside it. Priestly and political authority became joined in ways that would later create strain. Power, even power gained for righteous reasons, can become morally complicated. Expansion, dynasty, ambition, and internal rivalry would all become part of the later Hasmonean story. That does not erase the greatness of what was accomplished. It simply reminds us that human victories inside history are never the final kingdom. They are real and they matter, but they are not pure enough to save the world by themselves. For the Jewish people of that age, though, the achievement was immense. They had not simply survived a cultural and religious eradication campaign. They had reasserted their covenant identity, restored their temple, and carved out a season in which Jews were ruled by Jews in their own land. That is no small thing. It is the fruit of resistance that did not die when its brightest warrior fell. But if you want to understand the deepest soul of this period, you cannot remain only on the level of armies, diplomacy, and political autonomy. Because the Maccabean age was not shaped only by men carrying swords. It was also shaped by those who proved that the empire could wound the body and still fail to conquer the soul. This is where another text from the same era gives us one of the most devastating and holy scenes in all Jewish literature. Not the main narrative line of First Maccabees, but a window into the spiritual temperature of the age. A mother, 7 sons, a king determined to break them, torture designed to force obedience, the command to violate the law, the demand to surrender conscience in order to preserve life. One by one the sons refused. Do not rush past that, one by one. Not because death was painless, not because they were numb, not because they were trying to perform heroism for applause. They refused because there comes a point when survival purchased by betrayal feels like a deeper death. The empire could cut flesh, it could mutilate, it could humiliate, it could put fear in the room until the air itself felt unbearable. But it could not make righteousness meaningless. It could not make covenant negotiable to those who loved God more than safety. And then the story does something almost unbearable. The mother watches. There is almost nothing more terrible to imagine. A ruler trying to use a parent's love to break a family's faith. A mother seeing her sons suffer, knowing that one word of compromise could perhaps spare them immediate pain, and yet also knowing that some forms of surrender kill things that cannot be brought back by continued breathing. The scene is not clean, it is not comfortable, it is not the sort of story anyone tells lightly, yet in that horror, the mother becomes one of the strongest figures in the entire Maccabean age. She does not seduce her sons into cowardice. She does not tell them to protect life at any cost. She strengthens them. She reminds them, in essence, that the God who made them is not blind, and that the tyrant standing in front of them is not ultimate. She becomes a witness, not only to suffering, but to the terrifying strength of hope. And the sons speak with a confidence that burns across the centuries. They acknowledge pain, but they refuse spiritual defeat. They declare that earthly rulers can end present life, but cannot own the future God keeps. In their words, the hope of resurrection becomes not an idea floating in abstraction, but a conviction sharp enough to stand inside torture. That matters more than many people realize, because martyrdom in this period is not presented as failure. It is presented as testimony, not testimony in the cheap sense of a slogan, but in the costly sense of a life saying, there is something true here that I will not deny, even if denial would let me keep breathing a little longer. The empire wanted public surrender. What it received instead was public witness. And that is why the mother and her 7 sons belong beside the battlefield, heroes, even though they carry no weapons. Judas showed that faith could fight. They showed that faith could endure agony without yielding its allegiance. One confronted violence with resistance. The others confronted violence with refusal Together they expose the limit of tyranny. Tyranny can punish. Tyranny can threaten. Tyranny can kill. But it cannot finally command the inner throne of the human soul, when that soul belongs to God. This is the point where the Maccabean story rises above national history and becomes something larger. It becomes a revelation about what true freedom is. Freedom is not merely the ability to do what you want without interference. Freedom, in this sacred sense, is the refusal to let external power define ultimate loyalty. A nation may need military freedom, yes. A sanctuary may need physical protection, yes. But beneath both lies a deeper liberty, the liberty to say, "You may take my comfort, you may take my future in this world, you may even take my body, but you do not get my worship." That is why the age of the Maccabees has such enduring force. It is not just a chapter about successful revolt. It is a chapter about the soul learning the difference between living and merely not dying. And from there, the legacy deepens even further. When we place Judas Maccabeus within the larger biblical story, we begin to see why his memory carried such weight. He is not Moses, he is not Joshua, he is not David, yet his life echoes patterns already familiar in the story of God's people. Like Moses, he rises in a season when a ruler seeks to reshape Israel through coercion. Like Joshua, he fights so that the people may inhabit covenant life in the land. Like David, he stands against forces that appear too large and teaches others that holy courage can be contagious. These are not exact repetitions. They are resonances. History under God often moves like that. New servants rise in new crises, and yet the old patterns return. Deliverance, defilement, repentance, battle, worship, loss, restoration. The names change, the enemies change, but the covenant drama continues. Judas matters because he stands in that line of those who refuse to let sacred memory be erased. He is one of the men through whom Israel did not dissolve. And that leads us to one of the biggest truths of all. The Maccabees did not only preserve freedom for their own moment, they helped preserve the very world into which the New Testament would later speak. Think about that carefully. By the time of Jesus, the Jewish people still had a temple in Jerusalem. They still had a living attachment to Torah. They still had a fiercely guarded sense of covenant identity. They still carried memories of resisting foreign domination for the sake of worship. They still knew the language of desecration and rededication, compromise and fidelity, martyrdom and deliverance. None of that dropped out of the sky. It came through centuries of people who refused to disappear. When the Gospel of John mentions the Feast of Dedication, it is naming a celebration born from the struggle of the Maccabees. Jesus walking in Jerusalem during that feast means he is walking inside a memory the Maccabean generation defended with blood. The festival existed because men had fought for the temple, and because a people had decided that a defiled sanctuary was not acceptable. And it goes deeper than one feast. The world of the New Testament is saturated with concerns sharpened by the Maccabean age. Questions of purity, identity under foreign rule, the place of the temple, longing for deliverance, suspicion of compromised leadership, the yearning for a true king, the memory that zeal can both preserve and endanger. The belief that God's people must not simply dissolve into the surrounding culture. Even the spiritual atmosphere of expectation, tension, and contested authority in first century Judea makes more sense when you remember the centuries behind it. Without the Maccabean struggle, the setting of the gospel story would not look the same. The social, political, and religious landscape into which Jesus was born had been shaped, in part, by those who fought and died to keep Israel recognizably Israel. That does not mean the Maccabees were the final answer. They were not. Their victories were real but incomplete. Their dynasty achieved much, but also developed its own fractures. Their swords could defend a sanctuary, but they could not heal the deepest wound of the human heart. History still waited for something greater than successful resistance. It still waited for a kingdom not built on the unstable foundations of human power. And yet the path toward that greater fulfillment passed through them. There is something profoundly moving about that. God's larger story often moves through people who do not get to see everything their faithfulness makes possible. Judas did not live to see the full measure of political autonomy that later emerged. The mother of the 7 sons did not watch a comfortable resolution arrive. Jonathan did not enjoy an untroubled old age. So many of them died before the meaning of their endurance had finished unfolding. But unfinished in one lifetime does not mean wasted in God's history. That is one of the hardest lessons faithful people ever learn. You may be called to fight for something you will not fully see. You may be asked to protect a flame that someone else will later build into a brighter fire. You may spend your strength defending sacred ground so that a future generation can stand there more freely than you ever did. And that does not make your labor smaller. It may make it holier, because in stories like this, the measure of a life is not whether it personally enjoys every harvest. The measure is whether it remains true to the covenant when the field still looks costly. That is why the Maccabean story still burns with meaning. It tells us that faith is not built by convenience. Nobody becomes this kind of witness in comfort. Nobody learns this depth of loyalty by living where worship costs nothing. Identity is never challenged, and obedience is always socially approved. The faith that survives an empire is forged where compromise would be easier and safer. It also tells us that freedom to worship has a price. We often talk about freedom as if it appears naturally. It does not. Someone always pays. Someone stands when others would rather yield. Someone says no at the moment when yes would have been easier. Someone accepts loss so that truth does not have to beg permission to exist. And it tells us one more thing, maybe the hardest thing of all. The faithful do not always see the full fruit of their faithfulness in their own lifetime. Judas did not. Many martyrs did not. Sometimes God lets one generation plant in tears and another gather in joy. That is not injustice in the cheap sense. It is the mystery of a story larger than one life, that truth can feel painful until you realize what it means. It means history is not finally held together by immediate reward. It is held together by fidelity, by people who keep trusting that obedience matters even before outcomes are visible, by people who act as though covenant is worth more than applause, more than safety, more than the illusion of control. And this is why the death of Judas is not the end of his meaning. In one sense, alas, it was a defeat. We should be honest about that. A real battle was lost. A real leader died. A real community was shaken. But in another sense, the empire did not get what it most wanted. It did not get surrender. It did not get the erasure of the Jewish faith. It did not get a people who concluded that covenant had become too expensive. Judas fell. But Judea did not vanish. Jonathan bled. But the line did not break. Simon ruled, but even his stability pointed beyond itself. The mother wept, but her sons did not yield. That is the legacy. Not merely that enemies were beaten, but that faith survived the attempt to make it ashamed of itself. So when people remember the Maccabees only as a victory story, they remember too little. This is not merely the tale of rebels who won. It is the tale of what it cost to keep worship alive. It is the tale of how a people carried grief and still refused spiritual collapse. It is the tale of light defended not by sentiment, but by scars. And perhaps that is why the story feels so mature, so heavy, so unromantic in its deepest register. Because it does not flatter us with easy endings. It does not say that one miracle removes every battle. It does not say that the righteous are always spared painful losses. It does not say that symbols never die. It says something truer. It says that even when the symbol falls, the covenant can still stand. Even when the leader dies, the faith can continue. Even when victory tastes of blood, it can still become part of a larger redemption. The rededicated temple was not the final chapter. It was the beginning of a costly guardianship. Every lamp that burned there after that did so in a world where people had died to keep the place holy. Every song sung in its courts carried memory. Every future worshipper inherited courage from the dead. And that is why this story belongs inside the larger biblical imagination. Because Scripture is not only concerned with moments of obvious miracle, it is also concerned with the generations who keep holy things from being extinguished between miracles. The people who hold the line, the people who bury their dead and keep praying, the people who do not confuse loss with abandonment, the people who carry the covenant through history like a flame through the wind. Maybe that is the deepest honor we can give the Maccabees. Not to reduce them to a holiday memory, not to turn them into flat national icons, but to see them in full human weight. A father who would not bend, sons who fought, brothers who inherited grief and responsibility. A mother who strengthened dying children, priests, soldiers, villagers, refugees, worshippers. An entire people learning under extreme pressure that the holiest things are often the things you only keep by costly faithfulness. So yes, the temple was reclaimed. Yes, Hanukkah shines. Yes, Simon would later see a measure of autonomy. Yes, the Hasmonean house would stand for a time. Those things matter, but the deeper legacy is this. The Maccabees proved that an empire can desecrate a sanctuary and still fail. It can kill leaders and still fail. It can torture bodies and still fail. It can dominate headlines, armies, and politics and still fail. Because it cannot finally conquer a people who believe the covenant is worth more than life itself. That is why Judas Maccabeus still matters after his death. That is why Jonathan matters in the hard years after the glory faded. That is why Simon matters when structure finally begins to rise from sacrifice. That is why the martyrs matter, because they show what military victory alone never can. They show that the most decisive battlefield is sometimes the human heart. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. Hanukkah is not just about light after darkness. It is about the blood that guarded the light. The death of Judas is not just a tragic ending. It is proof that the movement was bigger than one man. The endurance of Jonathan is not just political survival. It is faith learning to breathe in the wilderness. The success of Simon is not just statecraft. It is harvested courage. The mother and 7 sons are not just victims of cruelty. They are witnesses that death itself cannot make covenant love meaningless. And the legacy of the Maccabees is not trapped in the 2nd century before Christ. It stretches forward into Jewish memory, into the world of the New Testament, into every generation that must decide whether worship is still worth protecting when the cost becomes real. In the end, that may be the most sobering and beautiful line of all. Judas could fall, the martyrs could die, leaders could be betrayed, battles could be lost. History could remain painfully unfinished, but the empire still could not win, because it never succeeded in persuading the faithful that survival was more precious than the cup. And whenever a people hold that line, no matter how wounded they are, no matter how small they seem, no matter how many symbols have fallen, tyranny discovers its limit. Because the mightiest kingdoms in the world can rule over bodies for a season, but they cannot extinguish a faith that has decided God is worth everything. That is the price of freedom in 1st Maccabees, and that is the inheritance no empire could put out. Untitled Chapter.